Hey everyone, welcome to this week's mini lecture 14 in week 8 of our summer 2021 course. And today we're starting our time travel unit, so we're taking a look at the Precambrian. So before we get into this, I just want to briefly review the geologic timescale with you. Recall that the geologic timescale we discussed earlier in this semester is broken up into different sections. So we have our eons, which are then broken up into smaller divisions known as eras, which are then broken up into even smaller divisions known as periods, and then broken down even further into epochs, which becomes more relevant once we get to more recent geologic history. Now today, we're focusing on the Precambrian, which is a term kind of used as a blanket term for the Archean and the Proterozoic, which are two of the major eons in early Earth's history. So today we're going to be taking kind of a look at the Earth. So let's start with the age of the Earth and reviewing this. So we talked about this in our radiometric dating unit, where we talked about how old the Earth actually is. And the oldest minerals on much of our surface date to about 3.96 billion years ago. Billion years is abbreviated as GA, so you'll see that abbreviation in some of these lessons within the next few days. Zircons are a type of mineral that are included in ancient sandstones that have also been found on Earth's surface. And these zircons are individual grains, and since they're in sandstones, that means that they had to have existed prior to that date. So those zircons are about 4.4 billion years old, and those sandstones are a little bit younger than that. The age of the Earth now is believed to be about 4.65 billion years ago, based on those ages that we've gotten from Earth minerals, but also based on correlation with meteorites and other moon rocks that we've collected from outer space. So we're going to take a look at a global perspective of this early Earth history first, to give you an idea of how Earth formed and really what early Earth was like. So this all begins in the Hadean eon, which is about 4.6 to 4.0 billion years ago. And here's a nice schematic of a timeline showing some of the major features that happened during the Hadean eon. So the biggest part here is that Earth coalesced and it came together at this time, forming what we see as the sphere today. Water comes around at this time, the moon forms, the core starts to accrete and pull together, which means that our Earth wasn't always differentiated into these different layers. The core actually had to come together at a certain time. The magnetic field was produced, and then the Earth experienced this late bombardment stage where it was hit very often by meteorites, asteroids, and other impact objects. So we're only going to look at the birth of the Earth momentarily, and that's because most of these rocks are not preserved anymore in the record, specifically not really in Nebraska. But the Hadean eon encompasses about the first 550 million years of Earth's history. It's got a whole bunch of that cosmic bombardment going on, as we just discussed in the last slide, and there's a lot of volcanism activity. From a large impact, the moon breaks off of the Earth and forms in its orbit. As I've already said, the magnetic field is created after our core is accreted, once we get that metallic core going. There's cooling of ultramafic rock at the Earth's surface, which you can see in this image on the right. And what may surprise you is that we had a very toxic atmosphere back then. It was made up mainly of water vapor, methane, ammonium, hydrogen, nitrogen, sulfate, and carbon dioxide. And the big one we're missing here is oxygen. And at the bottom here, I'm just asking water or no water. There's been a debate whether water is present at this time, but so far, more of the evidence is pointing to that there was some water at this time. Okay, so after the Hadean eon, we move right into the Archean eon, which is much longer. It lasts from 4 to 2.5 billion years ago, and it encompasses so much of Earth's history. The first major oceans form, we have evidence for the first DNA, tectonic activity comes into play. There's the development of our first continents. We see prokaryote bacteria for the first time. There's these things called banded iron formations, which we mine for iron a lot today, and those form. And then at the bottom here, you'll see something called the Great Oxygenation Event. And that is what eventually leads to us being able to thrive. So the Archean eon encompasses 1.5 billion years, and we're still not even in the zone where Nebraska comes into play here. So at this time, Nebraska is not there. There's crust cool and stable, but there's more rare bolide impacts or cosmic impacts. There is evidence for plate tectonics, as we'll see in a moment. And partial melting has produced mafic materials at this point, which means that they're more silica-rich than the ultramafic rocks that had been deposited in the Hadean. And eventually, these rocks produce even more silica-rich materials, which produces the felsic or silica-rich rock that we live on today on the continents. So during the Archean eon, there were proto-continents. These were materials that had cooled at the surface, and then they were sometimes recycled back into the earth. But these proto-continents eventually come together and accrete, and they develop into cratons. Now this diagram is just showing at the top that these are the individual proto-continents. And then the bottom one is when they've come together and created a stable craton. Also in the Archean, we're getting ocean deposition for the first time. So we start to see marine sediment deposition. There's the development of oceans, and that changes our atmosphere too. So it's going to remove a lot of water vapor from the atmosphere because it's now stored in our oceans. There's removal of carbon dioxide because it's allowed to dissolve in the ocean water. So at this time, mainly nitrogen remains, and there's still not much oxygen in the atmosphere. But there is some evidence for early life at this time. There are biomarkers, which is a form of DNA evidence, that have been dated back to 3.8 billion years. There's evidence of bacteria as fossilized cells, such as in black smoker environments that we would see today, about 3.2 billion years ago. And then there's also evidence of cyanobacterial blooms in these things called stromatolites, which are also about 3.2 billion years old. In the bottom, the left image is a photograph of the black smoker environments of today near mid-ocean ridges. In the center is a fossil stromatolite. Each line represents a different algal mat that grew on top of one another. And then on the right is where these stromatolites are forming today in Australia. So we have a modern analog. So finally, we're entering the Proterozoic eon, which is about 2.5 billion years to 540 million years ago. Now on this schematic, you'll notice that instead of the Great Oxygenation Event, it's called the oxygen crisis. And that's really a matter of perspective. For us, it was a great thing. We start to see the development of the first organisms that are our evolutionary ancestors. But if you're one of the things that were thriving in that low oxygen environment, you died off. So it was indeed an oxygen crisis for the things living at that time. After this, we get the development of the first eukaryotes. We have a period of snowball Earth, which we're not going to talk about because there's no evidence for this in Nebraska, but that is a very interesting subject if any of you are looking into that further. Multicellular life comes about, and then we get our ozone stabilizing as it has been for the last 540 million years. So here's a diagram or a map showing where there's the crust of different ages are. So the very black bold outlines here, these are all the oldest crusts that belong to the Hadean, the Archean, and the Proterozoic. And you'll notice that they're not everywhere. There's a lot of this stretched crust and younger crust around. And so we are in this portion here in the bottom of the North American stable craton. And we're near some Phanerozoic origins. And an origin is a mountain building event. So remember that in a moment. So, Nebraska has entered the chat. The first basement rocks that we're going to take a look at, these are the oldest ones that are in Nebraska, are about 1.6 billion years old. These rocks are part of the Proterozoic eon then, the youngest portion of our early Earth. And just as a reminder, gneiss is a metamorphic rock. Metamorphic rocks like gneiss that have these pretty bands, you can see how they have lines there. Those types of metamorphic rocks form in high pressure, high heat environments. And one example of a high pressure environment is when you get mountains forming. On the left is just a diagram of one of our convergent boundaries. We have an oceanic plate on the left colliding into a continental plate, and because the oceanic crust is more dense, it's getting pushed or subducted beneath the continental lithosphere. As this happens, you get melting of that rock the deeper it goes down. You get pressure as the two plates are being pushed together, and all that heat and all that pressure produces gneisses deep down in the earth. An example of where this is happening today, but we really can't see it because it's below our feet, is in South American Andes here in the image on the bottom right. So we have gneisses in our basement rocks. Now these gneisses had to have formed in a certain environment, right? So this photo here, this map, is an image of a paleogeographic reconstruction of what the North American continent would have looked like in the Precambrian. You'll see a lot of these maps today. These reconstructions are based off of the different rock types we see, and also based off of this neat thing called paleomagnetism. So every single rock actually locks into place the magnetism at its time of formation. So any slight differences in that can tell us where the continent was on the Earth's surface at the time as it migrated over. And as we'll see, we've been at the equator for a really long time in Earth's history. So the red box here is highlighting the state of Nebraska. You can see there's the black outline there. So in this paleogeographic reconstruction, Nebraska at this time is above sea level. It's on a convergent boundary where an oceanic plate is subducting beneath a continental plate. There's a lot of erosion happening at the surface, and we're getting formation of gneiss at depth. Now next, there's granites. So we have granites underneath us that have been dated to 1.4 billion years old. This top image here is a granite, and again, just as a refresher, a granite is an igneous rock. So igneous rocks form when magma or lava cools and crystallizes. Now what's interesting is today you would actually get granites forming in a similar environment to those gneisses. But instead of the heat of the pressure causing the change, it's actually cooling directly from the melted magma. But at about 1.4 billion years ago in the rest of the area around Nebraska, there isn't any evidence for an origin or a mountain building event. So really, these granites are an example of uniformitarianism at its limits. We as geologists are still not fully certain why these granites are here. So that explanation has failed us so far. However, we can make some assumptions. So we know from other states that at the time we still had to have been above sea level in this paleogeographic reconstruction. We were at part of the continental interior, which, as you see now, we have remained for most of our history. And there's erosion still happening at the surface, and granite formation is occurring, but what exactly is causing that is still a matter of debate. And then finally, we have the basalts. And the basalts have been dated to about 1.1 billion years old. So they're the youngest of our basement rocks. The top right is a photograph of one of those basalt rocks. It is also an igneous rock, so it forms directly from magma cooling. But there are some key differences between basalt and granite that tell us something about where it formed. So today, we can see basalts forming in rifting systems. In the bottom right is a picture of the East African Rift Zone, and all these highlighted yellow areas are where the continent is actually beginning to rift apart. Where this happens, magma is being pushed to the surface. We can see this in the bottom left diagram. That magma is mafic, which means it's filled with iron and magnesium, and it creates really dark minerals, which produce dark rocks. As that happens, it's pushing the continent apart, so it causes the continent to kind of slip down or subside and split apart. Now we see this basalt system extend halfway across the mid-continent. It's this pink color here. We've seen this in our subsurface unit. You should read the material in the lesson to review about that. So what this tells us is that at the time, Nebraska was part of a rifting system. We were still above sea level, but we're experiencing mid-continent rifting, and that's produced our basaltic volcanism, which produced the basalts that we see. And there's also sedimentary sediment deposition in certain areas around the same time. However, this was a failed rift, as we have not split apart from the rest of the continent. So by about 1.1 billion years ago, we had coalesced into one single supercontinent called Rodinia. Now this is not Pangaea. You'll see that we'll condense again into yet another supercontinent. But this is the first example of one of these supercontinents forming. Also in the Proterozoic eon, at this time where we're getting our rocks forming in Nebraska, eukaryotes or organisms with a nucleus, which are the foundation for complex life, come on the scene. This is about 1.5 billion years ago, so just around a little bit after our gneiss is formed. Multicellular organisms develop. There's a really, really great exceptional example of this called the Ediacaran fauna. And those are imaged on the right. So in the bottom right is a actual fossil. It's known as Dickinsonia. And then in the top image is a reconstruction of some of these very bizarre Ediacaran creatures. But they go extinct at the beginning of the Paleozoic. And then there's also this great oxygenation event, as I've already mentioned, where the concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere increases as a result of photosynthesis first evolving. So this is when we get our first photosynthetic organisms that use carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and produce oxygen. So that is all for our Precambrian lecture for today, our mini lecture. You should definitely do the rest of the reading, answer all the associated questions, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this lesson. Thanks for listening.